All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. So we are starting our first session of this 5-day event, and we have an excellent panel here with us. So the topic of this session is aligning financing with SDGs and ESG. Climate change is one of the largest threats to global economic growth and financial stability. While international cooperation to address climate change has increased in recent years, progress has been limited in transition to more climate-proof infrastructure management. Stakeholders involved in infrastructure development must urgently understand and integrate climate-related aspects if they want to align with climate targets and be cost-effective in the long run. As public-private partnerships, or PPPs as we call them, are a key modality in delivering infrastructure projects, PPP process cycle provides many venues to proactively manage climate-related risks that could arise throughout the whole infrastructure lifecycle. This session is part of the 5-day WAPPP conference's opening day, providing a strategic view on sustainable financing, decarbonization, adaptation, and role of the private sector in financing. New commercial financing demands environment, social governance, or ESG, usually known, taxonomy and measures impact which are aligned with new sustainability standards and sustainable development goals, or SDGs. Future-proofing PPPs means bringing new investors into the mix which are looking for ESG investments. Are new PPPs prepared for this demand from financiers? The panel here today is in a unique position to discuss the challenges and opportunities of infrastructure financing for today and for our future. So we have an excellent panel here today to discuss these issues. Let me introduce them. Marian is the head of climate economics at S&P Global Ratings and based in London. In this position, she is developing the macroeconomic framework that underpin S&P Global Ratings climate views and scenarios, as well as conducting research on the green transition and the economic impacts of climate change. In parallel, she is also in charge of developing the Eurozone economic forecast, providing insight into the economic outlook and conducting in-depth research on key macroeconomic developments and policies. Then we have Bella. She is a U.S. Director at Climate Policy Initiative, an analysis and advisory nonprofit organization working at the nexus of finance and policy for climate change. She develops strategy for and oversees research and initiatives across CPI's work streams and with a focus on emerging markets and developing economies. Bella's work ranges across climate finance topic areas, including blended finance, cities, and financial sector alignment. Then we have Benoit, who's we are hoping that he would join us. But let me introduce him while we are waiting for him. He has the global structured finance franchise of Banco Santander since 2018. Benoit joined Banco Santander in 2009, where he occupied several positions in the project and acquisition finance division, firstly in France and Europe, and finally in Latin America, where he developed the Andean region business. Prior to Banco Santander, Benoit accumulated experience in the finance industry, working in actuarial and asset liability management at AXA, then as a securitization professional at Credit Agricole CIB. And then also joining us is Ashok, as he heads the ESG practice and leads the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund of India, or NIIF. Its approach to investing responsibly, green financing, and helping build NIIF way of doing business. He has diversified experience of applying ESG across various asset classes, consulting, and research. Earlier to NIIF, Ashok led Global Infrastructure Partners and IDFC Alternatives ESG practice, working with multiple stakeholders, including investors, investee companies, sustainability forums, and communities, and managed $3.8 billion alternatives portfolio. He also worked on issues of biodiversity, food security, intellectual property rights, and coordinated groups of sustainable agricultural practitioners as part of the International Food Rights Campaign. And then we have Rizwan in the panel. Rizwan is the founder of sustainablefactors.com and an interim management consultant specializing in enterprise risk and sustainability reporting. Over the past 22 years, he has advised and delivered on enterprise risk programs for global financial institutions, and he currently advises organizations on their sustainability initiatives, specifically around their TCFD and TNFD alignment strategy. So as you can see, everyone on the panel has a long career in the sustainable finance industry. And I want to reach out to the audience. At any time, you can read the full profiles of all the speakers because I've actually only read part of it on the tab. So, and I would also like to hear from you during the session, all the audience participants in the session. So please put your questions in the questions tabs on the right. There's a chat function also, so feel free to chat amongst yourself and respond, as we want to ensure that this is a live and interactive discussion. I will pick few messages and questions for the panelists. So let's start with the presentations. First, we go to Marian, who will give us an overview of climate risks, and then to Bella, who will set the scene on the climate finance landscape. So over to you, Marian.
Thanks, Jyoti, and hi, everybody. So let me share my screen to start with. Hopefully it works. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So as you were saying, Jyoti, I want to start by talking about physical climate risk and more specifically the vulnerability of countries to those risks and what that might mean in terms of losses. So as such, I think we talk a lot today about the transition to net zero and what is needed to get there. But at the same time, we know the carbon budget is becoming smaller by each year, and there's little time to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So it's becoming quite real, I think, that climate change will occur in some form and that we will have to deal with the impact of hotter temperatures. So it's important to think about what that may mean. And actually, even in the past 50 years, we've seen that weather-related events have increased by 5 times in terms of frequency, so they are already happening. So what do we talk about when we think about physical risk of climate change? Broadly speaking, you kind of have two types of risk that we think about. So we have these acute risks such as storms, floods, heat waves, droughts, and wildfires. But we also have some more chronic risk, which may be things like sea level rise or changing patterns of temperature and precipitation. So you can see it's quite a few things to think about, and obviously they vary quite a lot by geography. And I would say what's quite specific about these risks is that there is a lot of uncertainty around it. So it's really hard to model where they will occur and when they will happen, even though we do have some models from the climate science. But as we know, we've never have had those temperatures in the past, so you can't really back your understanding on past data to understand the future because we've just not been in that landscape yet. And at the same time, there are a lot of non-linearities. So climate scientists tell us about tipping points. So that might be that as the Earth reaches some thresholds, we see more chain-like types of reactions, and the risk actually increase in a non-linear way. So it might be a little bit difficult to think about this risk when we try to make them tangible as a result of these uncertainties. But there is a way to build resilience to those risks, and it's important to think about those because they may lead to quite disruptive forces going forward. So if you just think about the economic impacts, for example, often the channels at work are as follows. So if you think of storms, for example, or quite acute weather events, this tends to lead to damages to the capital stock. So that might be infrastructure, or for some businesses, it might be their factory that is impacted. So it can be quite disruptive. And then for risk like heat waves, that may affect labor productivity because workers, especially if they're outside, when it's really hot, they can't work as they usually do. So there are definitely some impacts in terms of economic losses to think about. So that's what we did at S&P Global Ratings, and we chose to do this through a scenario analysis. So we looked at 3 different scenarios of climate change. I'm just highlighting a few results here for time reason, but basically, I think it's quite striking. If we stay in this world where current pledges are actually put in place, so that's the RCP 4.5 for those who know the representative concentration pathways, we would see 4% of global GDP at risk of losses as a result of this physical risk by 2050. So you might say, okay, 4%, I mean, that's not so much, but let's put it in context. When we had COVID-19 in 2020, world GDP dropped by 3.4%. So it's not that far away. Obviously, the way we model these dynamics, as I was mentioning, there are a lot of uncertainties around it, and it's really difficult to see out to 2050 how countries will adapt. So we don't take that into account, but it still gives us quite a good idea of the scale of the potential losses. And then what's quite striking, if you dig deeper into the results, you find that the disparity is quite big across regions. So you can see it in this chart here on this slide. South Asia, for example, will be around 15 times more impacted than Europe. And then it also just happens that all these countries which are more exposed tend to be a bit less developed. So lower and lower middle income countries face 3.6 times greater losses than their upper middle income peers. So again, quite a big difference in terms of impact, which suggests that each region also has to think about it on their own, because it's very different as we see across the globe. And also what we found in our analysis, because you can think about where the risks occur, you can think about what they might cost, but what is also quite important is how countries can cope, right? And then again, what we found is that the low and lower middle income countries, which are the most exposed, are also those who have less capacity to adapt. So they often have weaker economies, weaker institutions, so they can't adapt as quickly as the high and higher middle income countries. And it's a little bit, I guess, ironic, because the more developed economies are those which contributed the most to climate change, and not the less developed ones. So there's a bit of a I guess, a support for the idea that international cooperation is necessary to help the most vulnerable countries adapt to this problem, and probably where countries don't necessarily have the means to adapt, the role of the private sector might be a bit greater, because companies will have to deal with the problem by themselves if the government cannot step in. So I think that's probably enough to set the scene, and I'll hand over to Bella. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Over to you, Bella.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And a big thank you to Jyoti for organizing this session today. I'm just pulling up my slides, almost there. Great, can you just confirm you can see that all right?
Yes, we can see.
Great, well, thank you all again. So just as Jyoti mentioned, I work with an organization called Climate Policy Initiative. We're an analysis and advisory nonprofit organization, and we do a lot of work focusing on the nexus of finance and policy. In particular, one of the pieces of work we're most known for is something called the Global Landscape of Climate Finance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those findings today to really kind of translate what Marion was saying about, what are the climate risks out there to, okay, well, what do we then know about what kind of investment is flowing into the climate action sector to both reduce those risks on the front end in terms of mitigating climate change, and then on the other end in terms of reducing the impacts. So just to kind of give you a sense of what we mean when we talk about climate finance, like all finance, it's about enabling action or activities, economic activity in the real economies. So anything from investments in clean energy to land use and forestry to disaster risk management, cities, resilient infrastructure, energy access, and of course, this being a meeting of PPP professionals, really a lot of these touch on infrastructure. And so a lot of climate action and climate discussions are really centered around how do you finance sustainable infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. So what do we know about the investment that's going into these sectors? This is a bit of a complicated chart. It's called a Sankey diagram, or alternatively a spaghetti diagram. And what it shows is the flows of climate finance in the economy. And so at the top, you see what the total climate finance that we've tracked annually is, which is $632 billion annually. And then as you go from left to right, the diagram kind of shows you the life cycle of finance flows. So on the left-hand side, you have the sources of that finance. And those are categorized into public sources and private sources. So the public sources are in blue. Those are sources like development banks, both national and international, or state-owned financial institutions. Or bilateral donor funding. And then in the orange, you have the private sector funds from commercial financial institutions, households and individuals, and direct corporate financing. And then as you move into the second column, you see the instruments that are being used to do that financing. So debt and grants and equity, balance sheet financing, project financing, et cetera. And then in the third column, you have the uses just split between adaptation and mitigation. So again, adaptation is reducing the impacts of climate change, so things that reduce the risks that Miriam was talking about. And then mitigation, which is about reducing climate emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. And then finally, on the right-hand most side, you have then the sectors. And these I just want to circle because a lot of them, again, are about infrastructure. So you have sectors like water and waste sector, industrial sectors, land use, which is probably the one that's least related to infrastructure. And then you have transport and energy, which are really kind of the bulk of climate-related investment occurring today. So, and I'm going to just dive a little bit more deeply into those two sectors. So just to say before I get into that deeper dive, just to say one of the things that we've kind of taken away, because we've been doing this study now since 2011, is that we did in that early part of the 2010s, the first half of the 2010s, really see kind of very rapid growth in climate investment. I think a lot of that was due to the rapidly declining costs in renewable energy. But what we've seen in the last year has been, in the last few years, has been kind of a slowing down of that growth. And so while we're still growing in terms of climate investment, we're actually growing more slowly, which is worrisome because we need to be at a place where we are growing more quickly, where we are starting to get more into an exponential curve. So again, just to dive into a couple of those bigger sectors, so renewable energy is really the largest sector for mitigation and overall for climate finance. Most of that is coming from solar PV and wind and onshore wind in particular. So you see on the left-hand side that of this graph that renewable energy represented 57% of total mitigation finance, or $324 billion of investment. And then on the right-hand side, you see kind of the specifics around the sectors within renewable energy. Similarly, in transportation, we actually see that low carbon transport is the fastest growing sector in terms of investment. It's about $173 billion, represents 31% of total mitigation finance. A lot of that growth is coming from battery electric vehicles. So again, the costs declining pretty substantially within the electric vehicle sector. We actually see, again, going back to kind of big infrastructure PPPs, that unfortunately rail and public transport, though much needed, they're actually not growing very quickly and continue to make up a small portion of overall clean transport investment. So just two more points to make. So the first is that, where is this climate finance flowing? So we don't just calculate globally, we also look at the regions that it's flowing into. Perhaps not a surprise, most climate finance, like most finance, is flowing in US and Canada, Western Europe, and East Asia and Pacific. East Asia and Pacific is the vast majority is investment in China. And then the regions that probably really need it in terms of their growth, their rapid urbanization, and as Marian mentioned, their vulnerability to climate impacts, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, Latin America, they're actually receiving in aggregate around a quarter of the total investment. So far less than they need to be. The last point I'll make is that while those regions are receiving far less than they need to be, actually everywhere is receiving far less than it needs to be. So current investment levels, although they've been growing in that little rectangle at the bottom left, the blue rectangle is a small version of the chart I showed about the growth in annual climate investment. And you can see when you compare it to the projected needs for climate investment, and that's what the solid blue line is, going up to around between $5 and $6 trillion annually. What you see is that we are nowhere near where we need to be. And what you can really understand from this is that the incremental progress that we've been making in the last few years, while quite important, is actually is what we really need is a step change in finance. And the only way to do that, if you think about kind of the availability in particular of public finance already being 50% of total climate finance, more or less, that if you think about this kind of investment, this kind of step change investment is not going to come from public finance. And what really needs to happen is that public finance and public policy are utilized more effectively to leverage far more investment from the private sector. And I think there's quite an important opportunity for private capital to get more involved in the climate transition. And I'm really looking forward to talking more about that today. So thank you, and back over to you, Jyoti.
All right, thank you, Marian, and thank you, Bella. I think this has set the scene quite well for our panelists. Benoit and Ashok are coming from the financing industry, commercial financing, and Rizwan is coming from working on what it really means to be sustainable. And really, we can see that one message I take away from both of your presentation is the risks are quite high. They're completely underestimated. Second, there's not enough financing. There's a huge gap. And obviously, 50% of public financing is not going to fill that gap. So who can fill it? And MDBs, as we can see, are quite small from one of the initial financing landscape graph which you showed us, Bella. So I now turn to our two panelists, Benoit and Ashok, with the understanding of climate financing needs and gaps. What is their perspective? So it seems that whether it's commercial or development finance, they're all chasing the same low-hanging fruits. Either it's in the energy sector or more commercially operated sectors of telecom, ports, and airports. On the risk side, capital is bound towards high and middle income countries. And even in the East Asia Pacific, I think it was mostly China and driven by actually public financing. What about the projects which have a bigger impact on climate action and in countries where more money is needed? blended financing is one of the solutions to de-risk projects, as we heard in our opening keynote panel in emerging markets, with social return-based financing and long-term impact investor. Do you think that is a sustainable pathway to develop infrastructure on a large scale? Any other potential solutions? Benoit, let's start with you, and then we go on to Ashok.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question, and if I had the answer, I think we would not be there today. I think it's a little bit the chicken and eggs discussion, right? I mean, we always say that the world need money. There is money, but it's not flowing. So what's the problem? And we used to say that the problem is the lack of bankable project. This is the adjective that I would say the banking industry is using to explain this lack of liquidity. And I think this is where we have to work all collectively together and to understand what makes a project bankable. And I think there are a couple of points that needs to be addressed to make that money flow. One of the first thing is the size. As we said, there is a lot of money available for infrastructure, including for emerging markets. But this money, this big money, as we used to call it, is probably focusing on big projects rather than very small. And the majority of the big projects that can, by the way, have a very big impact locally are very small. So there is a first thing that we have to build together is to aggregate at the country level first, maybe at a regional level. Very small project to platformize somehow the way we do the business. We need to industrialize the project finance. Project finance, as Bella just mentioned, is going to be part of the solution. The problem is that project finance is quite heavy in terms of structuring, cost, etc. So we need to find a way to make it cheaper, faster, and more accessible to the small project. And I think the different platforms that the UN, the World Bank, etc., are working on are part of the solution. And if you get big projects, you can effectively attract more capital from the outside, more private companies, more financing, etc., etc. So I think that's the first point. The second, and it's pretty much linked to the first one, is to prioritize the projects. We see in many geographies very big pipelines, but not really correlated or at least connected. What we need is to have I would say a landscape approach rather than a sectorial approach or ministry approach, whereby you see in many countries a lot of administrations coming with their own pipeline. What we'd love to see is something that comes with a story and that already propose a transversal approach to solve the problems, and not a silo approach that makes it more difficult to finance. And I think the last one that I would mention here is another point that is frequently I would say mentioned is the political stability, the legal stability, the jurisprudence, all the legal, I would say, work that needs to be done in many countries before you actually have a sound and well-established PPP market. It takes time. The good news is that usually the infrastructure, and especially the social infrastructure, is a kind of common ground in the different political party or colors in the different geographies. So there is always usually a trend, but we need to implement very strong, I would say, institutions to make sure that those projects can attract international capital and make it scalable. And I think this is already what a lot of MDBs are doing today with a lot of success. But we need obviously to speed the process up because I think to get to the slides that Bella just mentioned, this is not about speed, and we are too slow as the world. So we need to speed up the process. Definitely, private partners are part of the solution, but private partner needs some, I would say, features to deploy their capital. And I think the public has a lot to do in this journey. and therefore the PPP, in my view, as a more than never before, makes a lot of sense. JT, if
All
I
right. I definitely have follow-up questions, but let's first go to Ashok and let's hear your perspective from a National Infrastructure Fund from India.
Thank you, Jyoti, for giving me this opportunity to be present with such a distinguished panel and understand this entire PPP work which is going on. And I'm really, like Benoit has put rightly said. I will talk about the success story which the governments have put together, and how we are looking at some of the challenges which have been highlighted by earlier speakers, Marion and Bella. And I'll just start for the wider audience benefit. Like NIF basically is a collaborative investment platform for international and domestic investors, anchored by the government of India, and it was set up in 2015. This is like in terms of your an experiment which has been done in the PPP model, where much earlier, like in India, PPP started about 2019, late 90s, when it came into action, and at that point of time, various aspects were looked at from making infrastructure happen within the country. So as part of that, in the mature phase, which is just started in 2015, which will last up to 2025, that mature phase, the third phase in which we are, at the start of this phase, NIF was created by the government of India. NIF manages three funds with investments in different asset classes and diversified sectors that generate attractive risk-adjusted returns. NIF thinks in long term, basically believes in generating returns through efficiently operating its investments through economic cycle, and is committed to investing responsibly. We have put forward from the inception our policies, our integrated the ESG and the climate risk into our investment decision, and we are taking up the investments through following our policies and all. So NIF, as you know, manages about 4.3 billion USD of equity capital investments across the three funds: Master Fund, Fund of Funds, and the Strategic Opportunities Fund. And each of these funds have their own strategic distinct strategy which is brought into play. For instance, Master Fund invests in operating assets and core infrastructure sectors such as transportation and energy. NIF Fund of Funds invest through sub funds by bringing in best-in-class fund managers who are focused on some of the most dynamic sectors, and SOF targets to build large businesses across broad range of growing sectors. And since we are talking about SDGs, partnership, SDG 17 is very important, and I'm going to briefly elucidate on the framework which we believe in needs to be brought in, which is around the five Ps, which is basically your public capital, private entrepreneurship, philanthropic capital, policies, and partnership. All of these needs to come together, and then only PPP would be a success. And in this, like as you know, 196 countries have adopted the Paris Agreement, and of which 130 have committed or on the way of setting their net zero pathways. And according to the IPCC report of 2018, USD about 3.5 trillion investments are required annually to meet the target, which is set for 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial levels by 2050. So in order to meet that, this 5P strategy is something we believe would be of use, and which will help global facilitation and transfer of technical and financial know-how between countries. So the path for mobilizing this huge amount, we think in the green finance will require the state and the market to align across these 5 Ps. So the public capital, both domestic and international, play critical role in offering confidence to the private market on where to crowd in. And we have said this we have tested this, and across our portfolio, I'm going to take you through that particular investment, and briefly take like how it has helped the particular fund to get the additional investments required in that. Similarly, private entrepreneurships. So we identify best-in-class fund managers, and who are expected to lead the capital with look at new technologies and bring and meet the expectation of much evolving that technology and commercializing it. Sorry, I'll briefly take another, just to share some examples. We have a green growth equity fund, which we have put together with British International Investment, like earlier CDC, and that is yielding amazing results in terms of decarbonizing the economy. The entire theme of that fund is to decarbonize the economy by putting up projects in utility scale energy projects, waste to solid waste management, wastewater management, and others. So I will take you through briefly later on. Over to you, Jyoti.
Thank you, Ashok. I think it's interesting, both you and Benoit mentioned that there's what kind of blending needs to happen, and interesting take on how public sector and government money needs to really, and I'm hearing more and more this word being used, philanthropy. And actually we have a session on the last day where we are actually bringing philanthropy to this space of PPPs, which we actually did not have before, and we are seeing more and more of that discussion happening, coming to the fore. So now I actually turn to, I'm going to bring Rizwan in. And question for Rizwan is, do you think this is enough? Do you think this is enough to turn the needle towards real impact-driven ESG financing?
Yeah, I think, firstly...
so no, go ahead, Rizwan. So I think you understand what I'm trying to ask you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Firstly, thank you very much for having me here with the, again, distinguished guests. I appreciate it. And I've learned a lot from this as well. You know, I think as consultants think that we come into an organization with all the answers, and there's always something else to add to the equation. But in terms of whether this is enough, I think the chart that was presented earlier in terms of where we need to be versus where we're going, that's testament to are we doing enough to actually mitigate these huge risks. One of the big debates out there at the moment is in and around whether, so there's this whole thing around ESG and sustainability being two different things and often convoluted as just one term. And where I'd like to hear some further input, maybe from Benoit or Ashok, is with regards to how are you actually assessing the true measure of sustainability? Because the debate at the moment is that, look, we can talk about how enterprise value is protected through all these ESG metrics, but ESG metrics is not impact metrics. And if we're going through these huge infrastructure projects, then how are you going about actually measuring through sustainability in terms of planetary boundaries and what the capacity is of that particular environmental asset, how do you then go about measuring your true portfolio impact? And I think the answer to, working around these carbon concentration metrics, that may not be enough unless we understand, hold on, that this particular environmental asset has a holding capacity of X. We as a portfolio are impacting that by Y, and how do you go about measuring that and acting upon it? So I think the question kind of relates to what Benoit and Ashok were talking about, but I do have one more question after that for Marion as well, please.
Would you like to answer, Ashok, Benoit?
Very, very shortly. So I guess we start with the same comment that if we had the answer today, we wouldn't be there, right? I think there's a lot of PhD going on right now to actually measure the impact on returns from a sustainability perspective, right, of all these new things. And I would say this is a work in progress in many, I would say, in all institutions. So the good news is that at least we realize that we have to do something. The bad news is that I think we are still looking our way through with the different impacts. What I can tell you is that there are some shortcuts, and I think I would just mention the work of the Net Zero Banking Association and NZMBA, who basically works on aligning the portfolio, the loan portfolio of the banks. And basically what they propose is that if you align your portfolio of the main concerning sectors in terms of climate, you should, as an institution, be more or less aligned, right? That's the underlying idea, and I can tell you we are working very hard on the different subsectors. So, energy, transportation, oil and gas, just to make sure that first we have a methodology of measurement. To your point, I think it's very important to have one and a common standard. Otherwise, it's going to be quite difficult to compare peers with peers and apples with apples. So I think we really need a common standard methodology, and we are discussing it now. And then we have to steer our portfolio. So once we know where we are, where we want to go, and I think we all see that the cliff is there. So we need to act very quickly. But once we get this, we need to steer our portfolio through engagement with clients, active management of, selling down maybe some positions, etc. But to this point, from a Santander perspective, we are pretty much inclined to engage with clients rather than just, sending off loans that will, at the end of the day, land in our other portfolios. We have to tackle the problem at the source, right? And we have to make sure that our clients are the ones that are transitioning, not the bank itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Banks are financing the system.
Yeah.
So we need to push the system forward, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of pressure coming on the banks, and this segregation between those two concepts. This is what we do. The problem lies in how they're maturing their programs, sustainable development programs. And I think that's often misunderstood, and the blame comes straight to, the actual financing houses.
So I totally agree with Benoit. Rizwan, a very good question you have put forward. The way at NIF, how we are taking it up is like this is our very initial stages, where we have been trying to put in place a system which will be creating the baseline across the three funds which I have mentioned: Master Fund, FOF, and SOF. So across this, we are closely working with the investee companies, and also we are trying to look at which SDG would be taken up. Like for instance, in FOF we have a fund affordable housing, and at the same time affordable healthcare. So these are matching with the SDGs which are there. And then we are also looking at to bring in the theory of change, in terms of input, output, outcome, and what impact it is creating. So we'll have that analyzed as we move forward. This is our second year in FOF to say like on we have put the right processes and procedures and alignment with our investee companies, the fund managers. So all of us are aligned. We believe very sincerely in the partnership. So collaborative model is taken up, and with our investors also, we are getting inputs and how to take it up. So yeah, totally agree with Benoit, like in terms of how to put forward, like in terms of the impact which can be realized.
Excellent.
Rizwan, before you ask, before you provide your comments, which will go to Marianne and Bella to answer, let me just put this, and this is also a question on the chat from the audience. Is there is a fine balance between uncertainty and preparation, right? So how far and how much can we anticipate the uncertainty as we take care of the usual PPP project risk or infrastructure risks, and then we have this added layer of climate risk, as Marianne has provided us the overview, and then we also have the cost of preparation. So how do we bring agility into our preparation and implementation while taking care of the uncertainty? So what do you see in your experience, and how do you advise your clients in doing that?
I mean, the one thing that I've written about this extensively is, and I think it was something used by the UK government here in some of their frameworks, was the maturity assessment. What happens is that we have frameworks out there to say, okay, go and deliver this. This is something this is the output we want to see. But quite often, in fact, I'd say most of the time, you need to now balance that against the maturity structure. So we take out that subjectivity from how it's interpreted, because it's all very well an organization reporting and saying that, oh, we've aligned to SDG 17, we've done this, or we've done a bit of that, which is good for the SDG number 5. So, but it's all, I think the reality is, and this is where the concept of greenwashing comes in, the reality is that people know and investors know that, oh, we're going to have a conversation around this. How then do you make that objective and to remove that subjectivity? It's around creating maturity standards. So if you have the example I use in terms of climate governance and the setup of effective climate governance and say scenario succession planning to maintain that talent in an organization at a board level, how do you then prepare for the next layer up who are going to be replacing you? How do you enable them to become mature in their climate related knowledge? Well, you could have a project that caters for that, but we don't know whether or not we don't know the effect or the effectiveness of such a project until you have a maturity layer on top of it to say that, yes, we do this, it's defined across the organization, we have structures in place, it's repeatable, and that's how it takes and it helps these engagement sessions that asset managers are going to be having with their portfolio companies, in the sense that just point us to a maturity level where you're at and where are you going. Can you now optimize this process? No, we can't. Well, now we've got something to work to. And I think that's how you create that stability in how you're delivering those outcomes for clients.
Thanks, Rizwan. And I want to go back to Marianne, actually, in terms of ratings. And we've had a lot of, every time we have a discussion on a project, the ratings discussion comes up, right? So how would actual rating of ESG help in better preparation and better anticipation of this uncertainty?
No, that's a good question. So I think inherently all these climate and environmental risk, or ESG generally, so social and governance risks, they've always been part of the ratings analysis. And that's what we're trying to highlight today when we publish things like ESG indicators, is being more transparent on how those factors have played a role in the ratings so far. Obviously, I guess, especially when we talk about climate, the challenges are quite big for the future. So it's also about thinking longer term and thinking about how companies can prepare to mitigate those risks. So that's why we do things like scenario analysis that I was presenting before. So trying to go around this uncertainty and predict some numbers on it. So obviously, again, there is a lot of uncertainty around modeling, and we know that there are a lot of pitfalls, but having some kind of scenario analysis helps us understand the risk, the landscape, and helps us assess those risks. So I would say that that's a bit how we deal about it in ratings. But yeah, I guess that's also something that central banks are trying to push. If you look at the network for greening the financial system, with stress testing and thinking about scenarios for climate, I think that that's how policymakers are trying to help the industry push and understand those risks, I would say.
Can I come in here, Jyoti?
Yes.
As well, yeah. So, on this risk and ratings question, I think it's really important. It also links to how Marian opened the session, which was talking about the extra vulnerability of developing countries. So there's a risk, I think, that developing countries will be more vulnerable to climate impacts, will have more impact from climate change just at this moment where they have high debt loads, where they can't afford to actually make the investments in adaptation and reducing their risks, and that then their ratings will continue to get worse, and it'll make them harder to access the financing that they need for future resilience. So I think this is where just kind of underlining many times the point made earlier about international cooperation and just a real need to support developing countries in this specific area and the way that it interlinks with ratings and their ability to access finance is quite important.
And Bella, while I have you, just a quick question, and I think we're going to hear this. We heard this in the opening keynote. We had a speaker from IFC, and we're actually having all the MDBs presenting in this 5-day session. And I go back to the chart which you showed us, and it's very surprising, or maybe to some people not, that MDB is actually a very small player in this field. And this whole debate about billions to trillions, it's actually being driven by public finance and commercial finance, and that's where, of course, PPPs play a bigger role. But we are missing this key piece, and we keep talking about complementing MDB's role in developing countries, but it's not really happening. And you showed us the gap. So what are we missing here?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, I don't know that I agree that the MDBs are sort of a small player in this space. I mean, I think on volumes, that you wouldn't, they are not, they are a small portion of finance in general, globally, and especially in developing economies where they were. So I wouldn't expect them to take, a huge portion of the kind of volumes of finance, especially when you look globally, given that they are only focused in developing economies. At the same time, I think MDBs are incredibly important to climate financing in developing economies. And there's a huge amount more that they can and should do that is less about volumes and more about outcomes and impact and actually catalyzing private investment. And I think what each institution needs to do, and in collaboration with the others, and in particular with the countries that they work in, is actually develop kind of financing roadmaps. And getting back to Benoit's point about having a landscape approach that says, here's the actual transition pathway for this country. Here's a pragmatic pathway. And, how are we going to finance this? And how can we use the MDB's relatively scarce resources to actually leverage more investment to tackle the things like the macroeconomic policy environments, the legal institutional the same time as actually driving and having finance, in particular, kind of different kinds of finance available for projects and for first of a kind investments. One thing that we talk about a lot is that guarantees from MDBs are actually exactly what the private sector wants and are sort of insufficiently utilized by MDBs. So, can they actually adjust the kinds of financing tools that they're using and to be more catalytic with what they're doing?
Thank you, Bella. I'm just going to share a question from the audience, and whoever would like to answer this, please go ahead.
Sorry, can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, so to answer that, I don't think there is at the moment a standardized impact assessment per se, and not that I've come across. There are now movements out there that are definitely quite mature in that, but I haven't come across something that definitively, and there is a lot of research from the Balloton report, Donella Meadows' Balloton report that set this scene, but I'm not sure, and I have not come across the actual impact assessment work. But having said that, the TNFD now, and this was going to relate to a question earlier, the TNFD are now structuring that, and part of their remit is very much to understand eventually will be to understand the impact assessments, then quantifying that on how we are impacting those 4 realms of land, ocean, freshwater, and atmosphere, and then the corresponding environmental assets. And that's where I see is a very, very exciting movement towards this. It would just be nice to see how the indices are now accommodating this research, and that's something I think an extension to the question. But I believe there are good movements happening, but I'd love to hear if I've missed something on that.
So I think just to share, like in terms of the IFC performance standards which are there, so IFC looks at the biodiversity and other aspects from cumulative impacts. So any investment which is happening, we try to look the cumulative impacts of that particular project, and from E&S risk and impacts are quantified. And in this process, like the climate change risks are also integrated. And once you know, like what is the trigger which would have an implication on the asset, that can be fine-tuned and put into the scope of work for the advisor. And that's how we have been trying to address the issue.
Thank you, Ashok. And we are actually almost out of time. I would just like to emphasize that, I mean, we heard from Marian. I think a key takeaway really is we cannot underestimate the uncertainty which is yet to come, and we have to prepare for it. And I think there's a role for both public and private and the facilitators, which are the MDBs, the international organizations, the philanthropy, and going forward, there has to be a blended model, not just for financing, but also for designing and preparation, and really thinking about these risks going forward. The second thing I think I take away from this is that, yes, standardization is increasing, but at the same time, more questions are being asked, especially in developing countries. The capacity of governments is not at that level where they're able to think that they can standardize things which are up to the international, or benchmark or scale. So I think that the policy side has to really increase if the pipeline development has to reach the level of viability and bankability, which Ashok and Benoit have spoken about. And Rizwan, I think you have brought excellent points about really the difference between sustainability and ESG and impact, really. And I think our goal is really going towards SDGs, which that's how we measure impact. Whether ESG and SDGs are really aligned, I think that still remains a question. And of course, I think we can discuss this issue for another hour. But I think it's something which I think WAPPP should definitely investigate in future webinars. But I want to thank all the panelists and the audience for such a wonderful discussion. And I'm hoping that I would see all of you again in the next sessions and in the coming 4 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.